Hello, everyone. Welcome to Workshop B, titled Narrowing Social and Psychological Distance. My name is JT, and I'm one of the Immigrant Integration Fellows at the Rockefeller Institute. And it is my honor to serve as a moderator at this meaningful event. So in this workshop, we really invite you to consider the interpersonal or affective dimensions of immigrant integration rather than viewing it simply as structural access or institutional inclusion. This is especially true against today's backdrop where American citizens are pitted against each other and the ensuing tragedies are creating such a deep emotional chasm. So we have brought together outstanding panelists whose works I'm sure will offer a rich set of perspectives on how to foster empathy, reduce prejudice, and promote mutual understanding between native and foreign-born Americans. Again, I apologize that we are running on a tight schedule, and I'd appreciate it if all panelists limited their presentation to 8 to 10 minutes. Also, I'll collect questions from the audience on the chat and present them all together once all presentations are over. And I encourage you to, leave your questions on the chat as they come up, because if we start collecting them at the very end, then we might not be able to address all of them. Without further ado, let me invite our first presenter. And forgive me if I butcher any of your names. So our first presenter is Mustafa Rfat. He's a PhD candidate in social work at Washington University in St. Louis. Mustafa will be presenting on strengthening employment and healthcare inclusions for refugees with disabilities. Mustafa, did you have a presentation that you wanted to share?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Please take it away.
All right. Thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here. My name is Mustafa Rfat. I came to the US as a refugee, and I am currently a PhD candidate in social work, focusing on refugees, specifically refugees with disabilities. So really my research stems from my lived experience as well as my wife's lived experience being a refugee with disability and navigating social programs in the United States. So globally, as you may know, we have more than 122 million forcibly displaced individuals. This is the highest on the UN record. Among them, we have 43.7 million refugees. These are the individuals who cross the borders to another country. This translates to more than one in every 67 people are forcibly displaced. So currently, we have more than 50 countries experiencing some kind of conflict and violence. If you are following the news, especially in Middle East, you may see the conflict that has been going on for a long time there. However, there are also like other forms of conflict in Africa, South America, Ukraine and Russia, and other countries. So who are refugees? Well, a refugee is a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being prosecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, and is outside of their nationality, outside of their country, and is unable to return to their home country due to fear, due to being prosecuted. So one thing, if you look at the literature, there has been less attention is disability. There are reports and some small studies that shows that when a country goes through war and conflict, and violence, the rate of disability significantly increases. However, we don't have exact number of disability in war-affected areas. However, small reports and studies, for example, UN released a report, I think it was in 2023, that showed that in Syria and among Syrians, more than 26% of Syrians have at least one type of disabilities. So this is significantly higher. If we look at worldwide, we have about 15 to 16% disability rate among the general population. So I love this quote by the Women's Refugee Commission that says that refugees with disabilities are the most hidden, neglected, and socially excluded of all displaced people. These are the individuals that face significant barriers integrating into their host country or while seeking asylum in a second country. They face significant barriers due to social, structural, and other barriers. If we look at the US context, um, if we look at the first Immigration Act in the United States, one of the main reasons Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1882 was to exclude refugees and immigrants with disabilities. They label them as a convicted, lunatic, idiot, any person unable to take care of himself or herself without becoming a public charge. Public charge means relying on public assistance. And these are some of the pictures back in the day where police officers or port authorities who have no experience with in medical field or disability field trying to detect any form of abnormalities. And if they find anything, they will be deporting that person immediately. And interestingly, even if a person was entered the United States legally and found to have any disabilities, after let's say 5 or 10 years, they will still subject to deportation. So statistics, last year the US accepted more than 100,000 refugees. For example, New York State welcomed more than 9,000 refugees. However, in January, as the new administration started, during their first day they signed more than 10 executive orders. They stopped refugee programs, and even though the court has asked the administration to restart refugee program, currently the refugee programs are suspended. So my study is a part of my dissertation. It's a 3-year work. It's a community-based participatory research, which means the study is guided by a community advisory board that consists of 5 refugees with disabilities and 5 service providers. And the reason why we chose participatory research is it's very difficult to recruit refugees with disabilities. So this was a way to build trust with the community and make sure that they have a say in every aspect of the study that includes research question, design, and dissemination, and etc. So it's a qualitative study. It uses qualitative descriptive design using snowball sampling. So we were able to recruit 41 refugees with disabilities and 26 service providers who have firsthand knowledge about refugees with disabilities. And we conducted 3 focus group discussions. To analyze the data, we used reflective thematic analysis. So among the findings, some of the descriptives, as you may see, the interesting ones is that the majority of the participants have minimal education, from no education to like elementary school, getting an elementary degree. The other interesting thing was that among the 41 participants, 25 acquired their disabilities due to the war. And that really shows you the importance of taking a look at disability among forcibly displaced individuals. And the majority of the participants had physical and psychiatric disabilities, and followed by sensory, that means vision or hearing impairments, and etc. So the overall finding was that there is really that lack of knowledge among refugees with disabilities about what disability means. It's the same thing with service providers, mainly resettlement workers, that they have minimal knowledge when it comes to what disability means, what type of services available for refugees with disabilities. And that is a very problematic. Um, and similarly, there is this disconnection between disability and refugee organizations. That means when a refugee gets resettled, there is no referral and follow-up with disability organizations. What that means is that literally refugees with disabilities are missing resources. What I mean critical resources here is that, for example, getting timely wheelchair, canes, walkers, hearing aids, accessing deaf access services, autism services. For example, when it comes to employment, accessing vocational rehabilitation services that has a specialized knowledge about helping someone with disabilities to get a job and sustain a job. However, the majority of participants, when we ask directly that, have you ever applied or heard of disability programs? They were like, no. And here are some of the testimonies from the participants. For example, the first one, been in the US for 1 year, stated that straightly, like nobody told them that there is disability programs. The following one, been in the US for 11 years. The third one, been in the US for 16 years. Had no idea about the disability services available in the community. Um, so why disability programs are important? So here are three participants who access disability programs. The first one, who is a blind refugee, who received, when upon arrival, was connected to disability programs and received orientation and mobility services. That means they got specialized training on how to use canes, how to access transportation, how to navigate healthcare, how to access employment, how to use Braille, and as well as received funding to get college degree. The second one similarly received training from vocational rehabilitation services and was able to receive a diploma and then secure a job. And both of them got, become self-sufficient. So that means they did not really needed SSI, supplemental security income. And the third one, who is a deaf refugee, and received help from deaf access services. That access deaf access services had an Arabic Sign Language interpreter who helped the person navigate employment, access healthcare, and etc. So now I wanna healthcare aspect of it and show you the importance of accessing disability programs. So the majority of participants, when we asked about healthcare, complained about communication and language barriers. That means they talked about inadequate language interpretation, lack of Arabic Sign Language interpreter, mismatched dialect, interpreter misconduct, and etc. And really the simple things, like for example, they said when we told the healthcare worker that we're from Iraq, for example, they automatically assigned us an Arabic interpreter, when in reality, they needed to ask the participants like what language um, you understand the most. For example, I am from Iraq, but I am ethnically Turkmen. That means, we speak Turkish language. Um, so when it comes to deaf refugees, they experience significant barriers. The majority of them talked about complete lack of Arabic Sign Language interpreters. For example, the first participants blankly said there is no translation for us. The second one, they didn't take me seriously because I could not communicate with the doctor. And the third one,
Sorry to interrupt, Mustafa. I'm sorry, but could you conclude your presentation within 1 minute, please? So
absolutely.
sorry.
I think I have only one slides left. So, and overall, like here you have two cases of two deaf women refugees who were both pregnant. The first one lost her child because there was no Arabic Sign Language interpreter. The second one got complicated that because she couldn't understand American Sign Language, she almost aborted her child mistakenly. So, with that being said, I want to bring the attention that the new administration passed a new executive order making English as a primary language. What that means is that we have less resources for language and interpretation services. However, we see refugees and immigrants going to face significant challenges to accessing basic services. With that being said, I conclude my presentation and thank you for listening. I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Mustafa. And again, I apologize for not allowing more time for your interesting and very meaningful presentation.
Okay.
Let's move on to our next presenter, Dr. Jacob Richard Thomas. He's an assistant professor in sociology at Corvinus University of Budapest, and he will be presenting on critically reflexive theory on assimilationism.
I'm unable to
Please go ahead.
start my I'm unable to start my video, so tech support will have to do that before I can share screen. Um, but I'm sharing screen right now. Um, so whenever that is possible. Okay, so thank you everybody. I'm very excited to be presenting here. I'm also very excited about to be presenting with so many lovely practitioners of this in this field, which actually I'm a kind of an outsider too. I don't work on mostly immigrant integration. I work on more international migration control. And my positionality, I would say, is as a white American citizen who grew up in a multicultural society, but who spent most of their adult life outside of the United States. And so I tend to look at all these immigration policies not as domestic policies as many of you or many international migration scholars are want to do, but more as a foreign policy and the extent to which it really limits people's possibility to immigrate and even enter legally societies. And can I please ask the organizer, how many minutes do I have? Just so I can keep track of time.
You only have 7 minutes left. Sorry,
7 minutes
eight,
left. Oh,
8 minutes.
8 minutes. Okay. So I'm going to be blitzing through some passages of this. There's a more provocative part of this I'd like to really get to. And so I'm going to really try to focus on that. So just jumping in, simulationism and assimilation, and I use those terms because I think it's very, very important for us to understand that there's a long intellectual lineage that's kind of rooted more in assimilation than the term integration, although I personally prefer the term integration. And a lot of the assimilation kind of work focuses on this process by whether the immigrant absorbs the values and principles and memorizes a lot of facts about the history and the language and the culture, rather than more practical and useful information. And a lot of that generates disinterest and cynicism amongst immigrants about politics. And often that's designed by these civil servants that don't really represent the socioeconomic and cultural diversity. But there's a lot of other work about how two-way assimilation is actually relational. Um, and there's lots of positives to assimilation and assimilationism, that, it's easier for newcomers to conform to the ways of a settled society than the opposite. This leads to fewer misunderstandings, economic, socio transaction costs, and civil conflicts. And it's largely been really smooth across generations. And there's a lot of ways in which immigrants perform assimilation that reduces the odds that native-born stigmatize immigrants as foreigners. And it's possible to have assimilation without assimilationism, or as Portes calls it, selective acculturation rather than forced acculturation. But a lot of scholars may be critical of assimilation because it forces immigrants to give up cultural, linguistic, religious, ethnic identity and customs, induces double consciousness, stereotype threat, stereotype promise, limiting socioeconomic attainment. This overlooks how societies never truly assimilate many of the racialized native born. And it can be segmented in terms of social class, increasing inequality amongst immigrants. And it often perpetuates racial domination by those absorbed into the dominated group over the dominated groups. So a lot of empirical research on the consequences of assimilationism would actually be really surprising to many people on the street. Compared to the native-born people, the empirical positivist literature tells us that immigrants are more concerned about the environment. They engage more in environmentally friendly behaviors. They attain more formal education. They contribute more to productivity and income on a per capita basis since they pay more in taxes. They have fewer antisocial behaviors, commit less property and drug crime, and go to prison. They murder fewer people. They're healthier. They have longer life expectancy, spend 50 to 60% less on healthcare, and they go to prison 25% less frequently. Um, and therefore, to solve society's problems, you would want to seem to allow more people to immigrate. But here's the problem, is that compared to first generation immigrants, second generation immigrants commit more crimes, drop out of school more frequently, go to prison more, consume more public assistance, preventative health care, and more means-tested welfare, are less healthy, and often speak less native-born language than parents, whereas those who are fluent in bilinguals have higher education attainment than monolinguals. So what is the issue here? Well, I engage in this case study as kind of, and I'm going to just blitz through this because I want to get through some of my more provocative claims. But basically, I look at the case of Total and I draw on a lot of body cam footage and a conversation analysis of oral history to show that actually, in many ways, you could see him as a model minority, as an accomplice in the Derek Chauvin's murder of George Floyd, even though a lot of what he was assimilating into was the U.S. culture of police brutality. And there's a lot of ways in which he was deferential to Chauvin. And this led to a lot of the difficulties that led him to enter prison for 3.5 years. So there's a lot of evidence of this on his police record. Okay, so I'm going to just go through this and point out that there's many ways in which immigrants assimilate into very problematic aspects of our culture. And a lot of that is there's not a lot of critical kind of reflexivity on their part. That then there's a lot of pressure for them to do that. For example, there's this great article by Tao and Soon that shows that when a lot of Chinese immigrants during COVID-19 were telling their American family members that they've learned from China that it would be better if they wore masks. A lot of the white Americans were resistant to that, and they said, no, the CDC says we don't need to wear masks and we can just cover our face with cloths, for example. And a lot of cultures from a lot of migrant origin societies tend to be more hierarchical and deferential toward elder traditions, making them maybe disinclined to challenge the status quo. So there's three problems of this chauvinism. It can result in disregard and rejection of cultural knowledge and contributions of foreigners. It can weaken the ability of the U.S. and other destination societies to effectively and diplomatically manage their relations. And it can discourage immigrants from criticizing their host societies due to fears of accusations of espionage, threat of deportation, and a genuine desire of immigrants to belong and see the host society in a positive light. So now I'm going to draw on some biological kind of metaphors and analogies to provide a critique of how assimilation can be really problematic. One is the biodiversity argument. I'm going to zip through this because I think our previous speaker already made. Diversifying societies and organizations tend to be more productive. That's the key. And I don't think I need to argue that one. The more provocative one comes from the Algerian French Jewish philosopher Jacques Derrida, which is this idea that there's a threat of societal level autoimmunity disorder. In the wake of 9/11, he pointed out that the attacks on Western liberal societies risk their own self-destruction if they were unable to tolerate the risk of danger from offering conditional hospitality toward foreigners that may just have a few people that represent threats amongst many that would benefit the receiving society. A lot of native born believe they're protecting society by being xenophobic, but in fact, they are destabilizing and harming it. The immune system sends out one example of this is how the immune system sends antibodies to attack healthy parts of one's bodies. There's these normative pressures to assimilate may perversely legitimize some individuals with xenophobic and nationalist sentiments to attack fellow members of society that superficially appear foreign or mixed, harming the society in general. Think of about all the anti-immigrant hate crimes. Second, the overconsumption of antibiotics can trigger resistance to them in autoimmune diseases. So immune systems attack the body's own modified cells. The hygiene hypothesis, in line with contact theory, suggests that those societies with fewer previous encounters with foreigners are more likely to attack the self. Think about California anti-immigrant proposition in the 1990s in relation to flu pandemic-induced cytokine storms that kill off more than the flu itself, whereas now California is a much more immigrant-friendly state once it passed through that era. Finally, a third example of this is how certain external drugs like radiation and immunosuppressives received by the body of the society can help destroy certain malignant cells, but also inadvertently alters the genetics and behavior of non-threatening cells so that the immune system begins destroying them too, until it destroys tissues and integral organs vital to the functioning of the body. So we can think about government policies like the Patriot Act after September 11th that were aimed to extinguish threatening foreign agents, but and engage in a war on so-called drugs or terrorism, encage children, engage in child-parent separation, imprison Japanese civilians during World War II in ways that deprived the native-born society of their own civil rights. I want to provide an alternative emancipatory inspiration models amongst the native born. One are those involuntarily that can help immigrants more critically assimilate and accelerate social progress in their adopted society. One are the involuntary multi-generational immigrants whose ancestors came to countries as slaves that have historically critiqued the gap between the ideals of the country and the reality. We think of all the Black Americans and how they tend to be much more critical of the political establishment than a lot of the white native born. And secondly, the diverse indigenous First Nations that tend to critique settler colonial societies, lack of empathy, intolerance, judgmentalism, competitiveness, materialism, and socially unjust destruction of both the natural environment and social bonds. Now, a lot of people push back at this point and say, why are you putting this so much on the immigrants to critically, reflexively assimilate more. And I will emphasize that it's really, really critical for the native born to allow, as Portes says, the immigrants the space to do that. The dominant majority of migrant destination societies typically wields far more social power than immigrants. Therefore, they are the most responsible for protecting the rights of immigrants to criticize their host society's pathologies, rather than demanding them to chauvinistically conform and perpetuate them via assimilation and the ideology of assimilationisms. This is what California's lessons from the 1990s was. They affirmatively and actively promoted a prolonged exposure to foreigners. This can function as a type of vaccine, inoculating us from intolerance and discrimination against the minority of immigrants that do threaten us via contact theory, containing the autoimmune reactions that may frequently harm us even more. What are the implications for social scientists, policymakers, and civil society? It's beneficial to have periodic studies about how immigrants fare over generations in relation to each other and the native born, or the legal social difficulties that immigrants confront and becoming members of society. We have a lot of those. Yet, are there diminishing returns to such research? Derrida suggested that the conditional hospitality is dangerous and risky, but we must accept this risk to evade possibly greater destruction from societal level autoimmune disorders, which can lead to social instability, conflict, and suicide. Respecting immigrants for more selectively immigrating into some aspects of our society, as Portes has mentioned, and constructively critiquing what is unacceptable to them, even as foreigners, can enable us to avoid perpetuating nationalist chauvinism plus our own societal problems. I want to thank you. I realize this critique is using a pretty wacky kind of theory, and I welcome any critiques of that. And I want to end with this apropos quotation from Abraham Lincoln's Perpetuation of Our Political Institutions on the Eve of Civil War, in which he said, "From whence shall we expect the approach of danger? Shall some transatlantic military giant step the earth and crush us at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe and Asia could not by force take a drink from the Ohio River or take a track on the Blue Ridge on the trial of 1,000 years. No, if destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we will live forever or die by suicide." And I apologize if I'm over time, um, or I, skipped over some of what I was going to present to you in this for the sake of time.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. I'm sorry if I made you feel rushed, but I really found it interesting, especially the biological analogies that you use to really make us rethink of this concept assimilation as opposed to what we might call more integration in a more multicultural sense. So thank you for your presentation and interesting thoughts. And again, the non-panelists, the audience, you can always ask your questions on the chat. And I ask the panelists, if you can, to answer them on the chat as well, since we might be running out of time when we get to the Q&A sessions. Okay, so our next presenter is Dr. Christian Matthias, the director of the Monitoring and Evaluation and Training Development Program, Every Campus a Refuge, or ECAR. Dr. Matthias, if you're ready. Are you having a technical difficulty? Okay, then how about we invite Mr. Charlie Sherman first.
I'm here also just waiting to be given access to turn my video on and share my screen.
Oh, okay, got it.
Great. You
Oh,
should be
there you
able to
go.
see my screen now. Let me try to get video on one more time. Yeah, whoever's
Yes.
running tech, if you could just turn my video on, that would be helpful. I can get started in the meantime. There we go. Awesome. Thank you guys so much. And thanks to all the invisible tech people who are helping make this digital conference work. I appreciate it. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Really excited to be on this panel with everyone. Um, since I spoke a little bit earlier, some of this might be a little bit repetitive, so folks feel free to ask me additional questions or if there's other pieces of my work that I can share. As I mentioned, I'm Charlie Sherman. I'm the manager of narrative strategy at the Opportunity Agenda. We are a social justice communications lab. We help advocates, organizers, culture makers, folks across the social justice ecosystem figure out what they want to say and what the most effective way to say it is based on research, practice, strategy, etc. I lead our immigration portfolio. I also have an academic background. I have a master's in social science from UCLA's social science master's program, where I look specifically on these issues of integration, immigration, public opinion, and sort of the disconnects between the ways that people feel about immigrants in the abstract and then the actual sort of very powerful anti-immigrant rhetoric that we see on a day-to-day basis. So I'm going to just skip quickly through in the interest of time. So, to give some color to the work that we do at the Opportunity Agenda, we call ourselves a narrative change organization. And so, what that means is when we work on communications, when we do capacity building, when we do research, we have a very specific kind of theory of change, how we think the world works, how we think people develop their opinions, and how people make decisions about the world and about things like immigration and their willingness to be excited about a pro-immigrant future, right? And so when we're talking about our narrative change work at Opportunity Agenda, we're really talking about narratives. And so I just want to do some ground setting to kind of explain what we mean when we're talking about that. So narratives are big stories that are rooted in values. They tap into our morals and our assumptions, and they hinge on our deeply held beliefs, right? So they help us understand the world around us. Narrative structures allow seemingly disconnected or unrelated individual stories and events to be organized into a whole and have a given a deeper meaning. And so what we mean by this is when we open up a newspaper every morning, we're not sort of having a unique value system or worldview every single day to process news stories, right? We read things and they fit within our worldview of this is how we think immigration works, or this is how we think the economy works, etc. And research has shown this is really the way that people make most of their political decisions, their ideological decisions are really centered around what is the large story that's being perpetuated around a certain issue, right? And sort of what's important to this narrative process are repetition and time. So none of these narratives are created overnight. As we talked about in the last session, a lot of the fight for whiteness in this country helps explains a lot of the different dimensions of anti-immigrant rhetoric in this moment. So there's narratives of sort of anti-blackness and white supremacy that have persisted and influenced how we approach immigrants, to this current day, dating back centuries. And narratives aren't created overnight, and they're really created through repetition, and that's what allows them to stick. And so they rely on people and channels tapping into the same values and beliefs to really create a drumbeat. So what this looks like is our politicians, people in power, our media, et cetera, all being on a sort of aligned large story about immigration. So the conservative story is that immigrants come to this country to steal, to not be productive, to commit crimes, all these other things, right? That's supported by a media that creates an overemphasis on the criminalization of migrants. It's supported by politicians who criminalize migrants via their language, and just all of these different parts of our cultural ecosystem that reinforce the ways that people think. And so with narrative change work, we really like to read this quote when we present on what we do, because I think this helps kind of explain why narrative change is such an important task, especially when you're thinking about really narrowing the social distance and psychological distance between immigrant populations and native-born populations. So I'm going to read this quote. It's from actually a different organization called the Narrative Initiative, who did really some of the fundamental work on narrative change. But narrative work, the shifting of consciousness and values, is not just a long game, it is the long game. It is not just about finding the right words to spread particular messages, but the ability to activate underlying values and beliefs behind those messages. It's about normalizing justice, inclusivity, and equity. So when I talk about doing narrative change work, it's about really trying to shape everything from in-the-moment press releases to long-term campaigns so that they're working towards this longer vision of normalizing things like justice, inclusivity, and equity. The idea is that if those things are more normalized, we'll be able to build on different political wins and different successes much easier, because the internal story in which people are telling themselves about immigration is one that actually supports our worldview, that multicultural world in which everyone belongs is able to flourish is a world that's better for all of us, right? And so I mentioned this in my last presentation, but three ways that we at the Opportunity Agenda specifically do this work. We do a lot of participatory research. Mustafa, it's great to hear about some of your research, and I think it's such compelling work that you're doing, especially doing work at, the intersection of two issues that are really sort of contested and difficult across the country. I think you get really like rich insights from studying that space and sort of the treatment, not just of immigrants, not just of disabled people, but really anyone who is considered like non-normal in this country or not sort of within the status quo. So we do participatory research, we disseminate that research and do campaigns, and I'm going to show you guys an example of one of those in the next slide. And then we help build the capacity of people who are trying to change the narrative around immigration across the country. So this is a quick example that I have of a campaign that we did, and once I'm off screen, I'll drop a link to this campaign in the chat with the New York Immigration Coalition called New York Proud. The idea was to showcase a diverse set of New Yorkers at their locations of work, but really expand the idea of what it means to contribute and be a working New Yorker, right? That's not just doing, a lot of times we hear the narrative of immigrants do the jobs that no one else wants to do, but immigrants also do jobs that like we love and we really want to do and that we need in our society, right? So as you can see here, we have food vendors, we have drag queens, we have yoga instructors, we have chefs, we have lawyers, we have artists, etc. And so this campaign was one in which we saw the narrative in New York was becoming intensively anti-immigrant. There was rhetoric from the Adams administration. There was the busing in of migrants to New York that were all laying the conditions for a real kind of narrative shift in a city that had held a more pro-immigrant worldview. So we launched this campaign to try to essentially flood the airwaves with pro-immigrant content and try to drum up a sort of different story and different understanding of the role of immigrants in this city. So that's just one example of what we do. And so three takeaways that I kind of just want to share on promoting connections. And of course, if folks have more questions, I'm happy to answer or dive in a little bit deeper. One thing that comes up in our work is this idea is that solutions for our current struggles around integration or communications issues, not just policy ones, right? There's a lot of policies that we need to change, but more so the way we market and brand our movements to actually build power is really the most essential fight, right? From a research perspective and someone who works in public opinion, the disconnect between things that people support in polls and the ways that people actually end up voting and vote against their own interests is extremely vast, right? And so really thinking about these issues as communication struggles, not just policy or institutional ones, I think is a really kind of essential frame for doing this work. Second is that as we build up supportive services for folks who are trying to integrate, trying to flourish in this country, we have to do that in tandem with narrative change around the story of immigration, right? So as people are being able to live a better life in this country, we have to explain why that's necessary. We have to really, again, be doing that communications and persuasion work. And one is not successful without the other, right? We have to actively be persuading folks in why, sort of, whether it's investing in services that help people integrate into society, things like that, are essential rather than just provide them. We need to also explain why they matter, why they make us all safer, why they make us all have a better quality of life, et cetera. And third, this is just a kind of consideration for everyone in the room. Our current moment is really allowing for a nuanced conversation about citizenship, migration, and community in this country. And I think it all represents a time where we really have to think critically of how we can shape that conversation, right? I think, even in the last month, the sort of acknowledgement that there are so few ways to become a quote unquote legal citizen, right? And follow these sort of legal pathways is something that's broken through public consciousness in a way that it really hasn't with other sort of high profile immigration enforcements or other things. And so I would also just say, one of the keys for really narrowing these spaces of distance is understanding when you have opportunities to really intervene in the conversation, because people really do have moments where public opinion can change rather rapidly. And I think, the uprisings in 2020 are an example of that. I think the response to immigration enforcement in LA has been an example of that. And so those are sort of some of my kind of, high level takeaways of how we work to help kind of narrow social distance through a nonprofit advocacy lens. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Sherman, for your interesting presentation. as you all know, Mr. Sherman was one of our panelists on the plenary session, so it was a great opportunity to dive deeper into the meaningful discussion that he has been engaged in at the Opportunity Agenda. Thank you again. And last but not least, we have Dr. Christian Matthias, the Director of the Monitoring, Evaluation, and Training Development Program, Every Campus a Refuge.
Thank you very much. My video is also, video sharing is also disabled, but can you all see the slides?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, I'll just proceed, and if the video comes on, great. If not, that's okay. And what's the amount of time I've got? I think I've got a pretty short piece of time, right?
Dr. Matthias, really appreciate it if you could end your presentation within 8 minutes, please.
Okay, let me see if I can beat that. Everyone, it's really great to be here. Oh, looks like somebody muted me. Okay, good. Hi, everyone. It's very good to be here. Thank you very much. What I want to do really quickly today is give an overview of Every Campus a Refuge in terms of the big picture work, sort of the framework for the big picture, and then the more focused work about how we support people in different campuses and ecosystems to build the resettlement campus movement. Every Campus a Refuge was founded in 2015 by Professor Dia Abdo, who is a professor at Guilford College, where I'm also faculty, following the Pope's call after migration out of Syria, North Africa into Europe, where the Pope at the time called for parishes around Europe to welcome and resettle families directly. Professor Abdo said, there's virtually no good reason, if not many better reasons, for campuses, college and university campuses, to take up this or a similar charge. With around 4,400 colleges and universities in the country, although many are closing every day, the facilities, amenities, and infrastructure of post-secondary education in the United States is perfectly poised to go through a transformative overhaul of its quite old mission. And so what I'll do is just kind of go through really quickly some of the big picture framework. Despite what some like Suzanne Farr or Walter Brueggemann call the myth of scarcity, this idea that most of us believe with kind of this vicious defensive mechanism that we live in conditions of scarcity. So when we're confronted with alternatives, that there might actually be quite enough to go around, although the ecosystem situation is tipping. We do approach things from a sense of abundance, right? That if there is scarcity, it will be empirically shown. Otherwise, we're going to assume abundance until proven wrong. Campuses are actually quite abundant in facilities, amenities, and resources. And what we're seeing is that nationally, as campuses, colleges, and universities are striving to revise and recreate their mission, these small cities are already integrated in many ways with local communities. There are some on and off campus or regional partnerships through which resettlement campus infrastructure can very quickly be built, or the partnerships that are not yet established can happen very, very quickly. So campuses, this is just a small snapshot of what campuses bring into those ecosystems. I'm going to skip through this really quickly, just some other more specific examples. We do is work from a place-based or hyper-local ecosystem model that, we could look at the global, refugee regime, the national regime, then the US, the state, boil it down. We really want to try and work with campuses as the epicenter around which, right, the focal point or catalyst around which these hyperlocal resettlement ecosystems can form. And so we prepare and support campus personnel to build on existing partnerships and build new partnerships in communities with existing resettlement agencies, other organizations, and develop those partnerships as the central actor. One of the key ways we do this is by bridging more conventional strategies of administrative change with social movement strategies. And so in 20th or 20th and 21st century social movements, this should be reflective of what many of you have said. Community organizing, direct action organizing, coalition building tend to be issue driven. And often these are about collective realization. So collective realization of transformed social circumstance. On the institutional side or governmental side, there's some similarities, although higher education tends to be a bit more administrative and managerial than governmental. even though the faculty govern the curriculum. More emphasis on networks, infrastructure, decisions and plans tend to be committee-driven or initiative-driven. And so we bridge these two approaches to prepare people in those ecosystems or prepare people on campuses to build out and help ecosystems, resettlement campus ecosystems flourish. So resettlement campus ecosystems is the worst slide in the deck, I think. I didn't quite get a chance to adjust the font size. I apologize. There are just around over 20 every campus a refuge chapters. So those would be resettlement campus ecosystems that are licensed as the every campus a refuge model. And then there are also resettlement campuses that pretty much do just about everything Ecar chapters do. But they have not licensed the Ecar model, and we provide support to any campus or entity that is working to do this. There's also on the website a list of interested campuses that are willing to name their interest as they're building toward moving either toward an Ecar chapter or a non-Ecar resettlement campus. So, for instance, if you just want to look at the state of New York, yes, of course, all those little things are those little mortar boards are indicators of potential partners around Borough Manhattan Community College. This resource called the Perk Map, you can look at it on the website or grab the QR code in the upper right corner, also allows us to look pretty much anywhere in the country where there's a known college university campus and find in the ecosystem examples of rural, small town, metropolitan potential partnerships. I'll skip through some of this, just more examples or indicators. So a lot of people in higher education, when you say, we want to support working with refugees, they'll say, well, we already do that. And we had to develop a typology to help campus personnel understand that they do things, but they don't do this. And so what we find is that many campuses do kind of type 1, 2, and 3 work or interface with refugees and interface with refugee resettlement or the refugee resettlement regime. They do not generally do what we consider the work to build resettlement campus ecosystems. The fourth type, and every campus refuge is the prototype, the original version, as far as we can tell. Although, for those of you who know the history of higher education, University of Al-Qarawiyyin was founded around 859 AD in was now Fez, Morocco. So may have claim as the oldest university in the world, and the woman who founded it, many of the people who studied there were immigrants and refugees. So the history of immigration and refuge is tied directly to higher education and recorded history. More specifically, the resources, the trainings, the approaches we use, working more directly with personnel on campuses, we try to prepare and support people as champions. So people are coming to this with energy as advocates or allies or accomplices. I can explain more about those distinctions or nuances later. The champions are bringing people with different interests or strategies, so how they see the world, how they want to go about change. You could add administrator in there, but they are bringing people into relationship and providing a framework to coordinate to build the resettlement campus ecosystem. There's a short list of some of the strategies, don't really have time to go into them in more detail, but we provide pretty intensive, usually 2-day at least, training sessions and prep sessions that include some practice for people on campuses around the country to utilize these resources. So the skill-based training, one of the things we try to do is help actors who want to do champion work understand that many of the forms of opposition they're going to meet or support they're going to gain have to do a lot with whether or not a person has skills and confidence. And we help them approach this by understanding that when you're confident and skilled, you tend to pretty quickly engage in action planning. And if you're underskilled and not confident, you're going to stress test. And then we go into more detail about helping them prepare for these relatively predictable responses by administrators or organizational leaders who may have, low confidence and low skill or high confidence and low skill. And we help them with the strategies to work through that. More detail if you're interested on stress testing and risk assessment. And at the more direct level with how to prepare to welcome and support and resettle refugees, we utilize methods around trauma-informed support and advocacy and best practices that are both drawn from different existing fields as well as our own best practices. And then cultural and intercultural humility, helping people build out from some ingrained cultural chauvinism and ethnocentrism toward cultural humility. And so we do that at the individual and organizational level, that individuals need to challenge our ethnocentrism and cultural chauvinism. We organizational cultures to also change the level of policy practice and impact. And so that is the quick overview of every campus a refuge. I'll go ahead and I think end there, and we can take some questions. Hope I made up a little more time for Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Matthias. I'm sorry, I apologize for not having managed the time more efficiently. Unfortunately,
okay.
we're running out of time. So, the audience, if you have any questions, please upload it on the chat, then we'll make sure to connect them to our panelists. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. And also, don't forget to participate in the following workshops.